Let me tell you something most people never understand about how power actually works in an economy. When you look at how the world moves money around, you'll notice something peculiar. Almost everyone, from the ordinary person on the street to the PhD economists running central banks, they're all obsessed with one thing: money itself. They think if they just manipulate money enough, print enough of it, adjust the rates enough, everything will fix itself. But here's what they're missing. And this is the thing that actually separates those who build real wealth from those who chase illusions. They've confused money for real resources. I call this money obsession, or money centrism. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. And the fact that almost nobody talks about it is precisely why the wealth gap keeps widening. You want to know where this really becomes obvious? Look at every major crisis in the last 20 years. In 2008, we had a financial collapse that triggered a massive upward redistribution of wealth, money flowing from the bottom and middle straight to the top. How did the so-called experts respond? Slashing interest rates to zero, quantitative easing, printing money, more money. That's it. That was the entire solution from the people running the world's economies. Then COVID hits, another massive economic shock, another massive upward redistribution of wealth. Same response: slash rates to zero, print money, quantitative easing, print more money. The economists, the people actually in control of these systems, they have one tool and one tool only. And when you only have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail made of currency. Here's the thing that should disturb you. It didn't work. Not then, not now. We're more than 15 years past 2008, and the lesson should be obvious by now. The power of monetary policy has been massively overestimated. When they cut rates to zero in 2008, everyone thought it would be this shock to the system, this extreme emergency measure that would trigger a real economic rebound. Same story in COVID. Everyone predicted these massive monetary moves would have massive real effects. They didn't. The predictions failed. The theory collapsed. And yet, what happened next? The establishment kept doubling down. The right-wing critics said rates should never have been cut. The left-wing critics said rates should have been cut even further. Both sides obsessed with money. Both sides completely blind to what actually matters. I remember being at Oxford doing my master's, surrounded by classically trained elite economists, the type of people who end up running countries and central banks. Smart people, well-educated people, genuinely good individuals. I was making the argument that the real problem was massive upward redistribution of wealth, that the middle class was getting hollowed out, that we were ignoring real resources while focusing on monetary tricks. One of these economists, intelligent guy, someone I respected, he looked at me and said, "The problem was simple. We just didn't cut interest rates far enough." I said, "Mate, we cut them to zero." His response, "We should have cut them to minus 3%. Think about that. His entire worldview was so locked into money manipulation that even after rates hit zero, the supposed floor, his answer was, we needed to go further into the impossible. That's money obsession in its purest form. I did an interview years back with a right-wing think tank, and one of their leading voices made the opposite argument. We shouldn't have cut rates to zero at all. We should have kept them at 3 or 4%. And I remember thinking, even then, you're about to see inflation come back, and you'll see those rates rise again, and you're telling me that's going to fix things. Both sides of the political spectrum, both claiming expertise, both completely trapped in the same money-centric delusion. The establishment tries to solve real problems with monetary adjustments. The critics attack from the left and right using the same framework. Nobody steps outside the box. Nobody asks the fundamental question: What if money is just the wrong tool entirely for understanding what's actually happening? And that's precisely why wealth keeps concentrating at the top while everyone else gets poorer. Because they're all playing a game that ignores the actual rules of how resources work. The pattern is undeniable at this point. Crisis happens. Real resources get redistributed upward. Everyone focuses on money. Monetary policy fails to deliver the promised results. Living standards collapse. And nobody notices because they're too busy watching the money narrative. This is where the real power lies. Not in understanding money, but in understanding what money actually represents. And why confusing the two keeps you perpetually broke while others get exponentially richer. There's something I want to walk you through that might sound strange at first, but once you understand it, it explains everything about how modern economies actually function and why ordinary people remain trapped while elites accumulate power. Go back to medieval Europe for a moment. In Christianity, Judaism, Islam, across these major religions, there was this fundamental commandment. Do not worship graven images. Don't make statues of God. Don't paint pictures of God. The logic was straightforward, but revealing. If you create an image of God, people will start worshiping the image instead of what the image represents. They'll confuse the representation for the actual thing. This became so serious that in the 8th and 9th centuries, people were literally killing each other over whether you should be allowed to have a picture of God. Wars fought over images because they understood something deeply important about human psychology. Once you create a symbol, people forget what it symbolizes. Now listen to me carefully, because this is the moment where everything clicks into focus. That exact same confusion is happening right now with money. Money is a representation. It's a symbol. It's a claim on real resources, on buildings, on labor, on goods, on actual things that exist in the physical world. But somewhere along the way, we started worshiping the symbol instead of understanding what it represents. Money has become the new religion, and people have completely confused it for actual wealth. They think if you have more money, you have more real things. They think if you print more money, you have more real things. They think if you move money around, you're actually moving real resources, but you're not. You're just moving symbols around, while the actual resources sit exactly where they were. This confusion is so complete that it prevents people from seeing what's directly in front of their eyes. Let me show you exactly how this plays out. During COVID, the UK government knew, and I mean they knew with certainty, that they were going to distribute roughly £1 trillion. £1 trillion. That's about 20 grand per person. The US numbers were even bigger. And here's what should have been immediately obvious to anyone thinking clearly. When you print a massive amount of money and inject it into an economy where nothing has changed about the actual resources, no new factories were built, no new land was created, no new goods suddenly appeared, what happens next is entirely predictable. The money spreads out, prices rise, inflation hits, asset prices explode. It's not complicated. It's basic logic. If you double the money supply, but keep the same amount of real stuff, the money becomes worth less. Each pound buys less. Prices go up. But what was the media actually saying at the time? They were saying people have so much money now, we're going to have this incredible economic boom when everything reopens. How is that possible? How can intelligent people not understand that printing money without creating real resources doesn't create wealth? It just redistributes purchasing power and erodes its value. It reminds me of that scene in the movie Idiocracy, where the main character becomes president, and his solution to everything is to give everyone $1 billion, and suddenly, everyone's a billionaire. It's childlike logic. It's the kind of thing you'd hear from a kid saying, "Why don't we just make more money? Why doesn't everyone just have $1 billion?" And yet, that's essentially what we did during COVID. We printed the money. We distributed it. and the predicted consequences happened exactly on schedule. Massive inflation, massive asset price increases, real purchasing power destroyed for ordinary people while asset owners got richer. I made a lot of money betting on these things because they were obvious. I spoke publicly about what was coming. And yet, the entire media narrative was still trapped in money obsession, still believing that you can solve economic problems by manipulating monetary symbols. This is what happens when you worship the image instead of understanding what it represents. You lose all connection to reality. You start believing nonsensical things. You start implementing policies that guarantee failure because you're operating from a fundamentally broken framework. Here's the deeper implication of this, and why it matters for you specifically. When you're obsessed with money, you start believing you can do things without cost. The government's current economic policy, this idea of build, 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 grow, 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 is built entirely on the assumption that if we just move enough money around, if we just adjust enough monetary dials, we can have growth without anyone having to sacrifice anything. They even try to convince ordinary people to stop holding cash and start buying stocks and shares, as if moving money from a savings account into equity markets somehow creates economic growth. Think about how absurd that is. You're not creating anything new. You're not building anything. You're literally just moving a claim on existing resources from one person's name to another. But because you're obsessed with money, it feels like something real is happening. The tragic part is that this confusion between money and real resources allows the real transfer of wealth to happen completely invisibly. While everyone's arguing about interest rates and monetary policy, and whether we printed enough or too much money, actual resources, buildings, land, productive capacity, ownership stakes in real enterprises are being systematically transferred from ordinary people to the wealthy. And nobody notices because they're all focused on the wrong thing. They're watching the money narrative while the real game happens in the background. Let me be brutally honest with you about the economic reality that nobody wants to acknowledge. We do not live in a world of unlimited resources waiting to be tapped. We do not live in an economy where you can just create growth without taking something from somewhere else. We live in a fully used, fully owned resource economy, and understanding this single fact changes everything about how you should think about building wealth and protecting what you have. Every piece of land is owned. Every building is owned. Every resource is allocated. There are no unemployed masses sitting around waiting to be put to work. There are no vast forests waiting to be cut down for your personal use. Everything is taken. Everything is spoken for. And in this reality, the obsession with money becomes not just foolish, it becomes dangerous. Because it blinds you to the actual competitive game being played. When people tell you that we can always create more resources, when they say we're not in a zero-sum situation, they're operating from a fantasy. They're imagining an economy that doesn't exist. Yes, there were times in history when this was actually true. The European colonization of America is the perfect example. You had Native Americans living on the land, but they were systematically driven out, essentially genocided, which left vast amounts of genuinely unused territory. Then you had unemployed Europeans, displaced people, people with nothing. You take those people, you send them to America, you give them access to infinite land, and suddenly you can grow and grow and grow. Resources were genuinely available. Population could expand. The economy could expand without anyone losing anything, because there was so much empty space. That was a legitimate period of expansion, without redistribution. That world is gone. We don't have it anymore. And this is the hard truth that money obsession prevents people from seeing. If you want more houses built in your country right now, those resources have to come from somewhere. They don't just materialize. You can't wish them into existence by printing money. The builders who would construct those houses, right now they're making kitchen extensions and renovations for wealthy people's homes. The materials, the equipment, the labor, it's all allocated. If you want to redirect those resources toward building new housing for ordinary people, you have to take them away from whoever's currently using them. That's not a zero-sum fallacy. That's just reality. That's how resource allocation actually works. I see comments all the time from people saying, "You're talking about zero-sum thinking. We can always make more resources." Okay, how? Tell me specifically how. Because at this exact moment, everything is being used. Everything is allocated. If you want to build more resources, if you want to create something new, somebody has to consume less. The resources have to come from somewhere. This is where the money obsession becomes genuinely destructive, because it creates the illusion that you can grow the economy without addressing the distribution question. It allows politicians to promise growth without cost. It allows wealthy people to keep their consumption patterns while pretending ordinary people can also have more. It's a lie. And it's a lie that only works if you're confused about money versus real resources. Think about it from the individual level first, because this is where people get confused. If you're a wealthy person and you have $2 or $3 million in your account, you can go out and buy a plot of land. You can hire builders and materials. You can create something new. From your individual perspective, it looks like you created value. But here's what actually happened. You used your purchasing power to outbid someone else for those resources. You redirected builders and materials away from whatever else they were doing. In a society where all resources are already fully utilized, you didn't create growth. You redirected existing resources toward yourself. That's the difference between individual economics and national economics that almost nobody understands. What works for an individual, accumulating capital to buy things, doesn't work the same way at a national scale when you've run out of unused resources. The current situation is even more extreme because resources aren't just fully allocated. They're increasingly concentrated. You have a tiny group of people who own massive amounts of real assets. They have enormous luxury consumption. They have multiple properties, yachts, private jets, art collections worth millions. Meanwhile, ordinary people are struggling with housing costs, with basic living expenses, with stagnant wages. And the solution, the actual structural solution, is obvious but politically impossible. You need to reduce the consumption of the people who own everything so that resources can be redirected toward productive investment and toward improving living standards for ordinary people. There's no other way to do it. Not in the short term. Not in a fully used economy. You either deal with redistribution or you don't get growth. Period. This is why the naive borrow and grow policies keep failing. The government says, we're going to borrow money from wealthy people and we're going to invest it in infrastructure and growth. But here's what actually happens. The wealthy people lend the money at interest, which means any growth that occurs gets captured by them in the form of returns on their loans. They keep their assets. They keep their consumption. They get paid interest on top of everything else, and ordinary people get to work harder to pay back the debt while their real resource situation doesn't improve. You haven't solved the distribution problem. You've made it worse by adding debt on top of it. The money obsession lets this happen invisibly. People focus on whether interest rates are right, whether we're printing enough money, whether fiscal policy is stimulative enough. They're arguing about monetary dials, while the actual game, the redistribution of real resources, is happening right in front of them. The truly wealthy understand this. They don't obsess over money because they understand that money is just a claim on real things. They obsess over owning the real things: land, buildings, productive enterprises, natural resources. These are what matter. This is where power actually concentrates. And as long as you're confused about money, as long as you're playing the money game instead of understanding the real resources game, you're losing. Now, I'm going to bring this directly to you, because this isn't abstract theory. This is about your actual wealth, your actual future, and what's being taken from you right now while you're distracted by money narratives. Money centrism creates a beautiful illusion. The illusion that you can have growth without cost, that the economy can expand without anyone losing anything, that if we just adjust the right monetary levers, everything will work out fine for everyone. It's a comforting lie. It's also completely false. We exist in a world of real resources. We exist in a world where things are owned. We exist in a world where if someone gains something, someone else has to lose something. At least in the short term. At least until you fundamentally expand what's being produced. And right now, we're not expanding production in ways that benefit ordinary people. We're redistributing what already exists, and it's being redistributed upward. I want you to do something simple. Walk down your street. Look at the buildings. Look at the high street. Look at what's actually there. Notice the shops, the offices, the apartments, the infrastructure. These are real resources. These are what matter. The people working in those buildings, the people building them, the people maintaining them. These are real people doing real work. This is the actual economy, not the money flowing through digital ledgers, not the interest rate discussions on news channels, not the monetary policy debates. The real economy is the physical world of assets, labor, goods, and services. The distribution of these real things. Who owns them? Who benefits from them? Who has access to them? That's what determines whether you're going to be rich or poor. That's what determines whether your children will have opportunities or be locked into perpetual economic struggle. Here's what's actually happening right now, and I need you to see this clearly. Real resources are being aggressively transferred away from the middle class, away from the working class, away from government services, and directly toward the super wealthy. This isn't a side effect of our economic policies. This is the primary effect. This is the actual game. The assets aren't sitting on the sidelines waiting to be allocated. They're being actively captured. Real estate prices are rising while wage growth stagnates. That means property owners are capturing more wealth while workers capture less. Stock prices are soaring while median incomes stay flat. That means asset owners are capturing gains while workers are left behind. The government's share of resources is shrinking. Public services are being cut. Infrastructure is deteriorating. Public assets are being privatized. While the wealthy's share expands, this is redistribution happening in real time. And it's happening because everyone's focused on money while ignoring what actually matters. Think about the people at the absolute top of the wealth ladder. I'm talking about the individuals with passive income of $1 million, $2 million per week. Not per year, per week. These aren't people trading stocks frantically, checking their portfolios, obsessing over money. They're not worried about interest rates or inflation or monetary policy. Why? Because they understand something you might not. They own the real assets. They own the buildings. They own the land. They own the productive enterprises. They own the claims on resources. The money they have is just a representation of these ownership stakes. And because they understand this, they spend their time and energy doing one thing, increasing their share of real resources. They buy more property. They acquire more businesses. They expand their land holdings. They increase their passive income streams. They're playing the real game while everyone else argues about money. Meanwhile, what's happening to your share? If you're not actively protecting it, it's shrinking. This is the hard truth that money obsession prevents people from acknowledging. The wealthy are systematically taking a larger piece of the pie. And if you're not paying attention to real resources, if you're distracted by money narratives, if you're hoping that monetary policy will somehow work out in your favor, if you're trusting that growth will trickle down, your slice gets smaller every year, compounding. Your purchasing power erodes. Your access to housing gets harder. Your ability to build wealth gets more constrained. Your children's opportunities shrink. And you never see it coming because you're watching the money story instead of watching the real resource redistribution. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. Asset prices rise because the wealthy keep buying assets, consolidating ownership. This means ordinary people need more money to buy the same assets, which means they need higher incomes, which they don't get because wages are stagnant. So they take on more debt. They mortgage themselves to the hilt. They become dependent on the asset owners, dependent on landlords, dependent on employers, dependent on the financial system that the wealthy control. Meanwhile, the wealthy use their ownership stakes to generate passive income, which they use to buy more assets, which generates more passive income. It's a compounding machine that works in their favor and against you. And it works invisibly, hidden behind the noise of monetary policy debates and money narratives. Here's what you need to understand about building actual wealth, the kind that compounds and protects you. Money is not the goal. Money is a tool. Real resources are the goal. The specific question you should be asking yourself every single day is this: am I increasing my share of real resources, or am I losing it? Do I own more productive assets than I did last year? Do I have claims on more income-generating property? Do I have more land? Do I have more ownership stakes in valuable enterprises? Or am I just accumulating currency, watching its purchasing power erode, while the truly wealthy accumulate actual assets and their wealth compounds? This is the distinction that separates those who build generational wealth from those who remain perpetually trapped in the money game. The people who understand this, the actual wealthy, not the lottery winners or the tech executives who got lucky, they focus obsessively on one thing: acquiring real assets before everyone else figures out they matter. They buy property when nobody wants it. They acquire businesses when they're undervalued. They accumulate land when people are distracted. They understand that money is infinite. Governments can print it, central banks can create it, but real resources are finite. There's only so much land. There's only so much productive capacity. There's only so much real wealth to own. And if you're not actively acquiring your share, while others are distracted by money narratives, your share shrinks by default. The closing point I need you to hear is this, and I want it to be crystal clear. Money is not the only thing that matters. In fact, money might matter less than you think. What matters is your share of real resources. What matters is whether you own assets or whether you work for asset owners. What matters is whether your wealth is compounding through ownership or whether it's eroding through currency debasement and asset price inflation. What matters is whether you're playing the real game, the game of accumulating and protecting claims on actual resources, or whether you're distracted by the money game. If you do not focus on protecting and expanding your share of real resources, I guarantee you that the people with million-pound weekly passive incomes will increase their share. They will own more. They will control more. And your share will decrease. Not because they're smarter, not because they work harder, but because they understand what actually matters while you're still obsessing over money. The choice is yours. Protect your share of real resources or watch it disappear.